This lecture on terrorism focuses on three aspects of the problem: defining terrorism, identifying the causes of terrorism, and determining whether or not it's effective as a political strategy. So I'll turn to the first subject. What is terrorism? Those of us who study terrorism certainly thought that after the attacks of September the 11th, 2001, there'd be no more debate over defining terrorism. It seemed pretty clear what terrorism was. But all the same, the term remains contested and controversial. In fact, the Obama administration even tried to substitute the term violent extremism for terrorism in an effort to distance itself from the counter-terrorist policies of the Bush administration and the war on terrorism. So is it possible to develop a neutral and objective concept rather than a term of opprobrium used simply to condemn one's enemies? The first thing to remember is that terrorism is one form of political violence. There are other forms of violence that are equally, if not more destructive or horrifying or terrifying even. Second, it's a method or a strategy. It's not tied to any particular political actor or type of actor. Although the term terrorist organization is used frequently, for example, the U.S. government maintains a list of foreign terrorist organizations known as the FTO list, I prefer to avoid the term because the organizations that use terrorism rarely do so exclusively. And if you use the term terrorist organization, I think this is what it implies. I think also that it's still useful to think of terrorism in terms of the 19th century concept of propaganda of the deed, which is a concept that came from the anarchist movement of the 1880s. This means that the act of violence is a way of communicating a message, which means also that the violence involved is highly symbolic and that it's intended to influence a watching audience. And the concept of an audience is critical. Because this violence aims at the effect of shock and surprise and outrage, it often targets victims who are unprepared and undefended. They're frequently described as innocent. They have no responsibility for whatever evils or transgressions those who are using terrorism object to. So terrorism deliberately chooses civilians as targets. They're not collateral damage that might be incurred when the real target is the adversary's military forces. The specific form of violence is also selected in order to be shocking and disturbing. We think of suicide attacks, in which the perpetrator blows him or herself up with the bomb. We think of videoed beheadings by al-Qaeda in Iraq and ISIS, and also al-Qaeda itself in Pakistan. We also think of terrorism in terms of the ism part of terrorism as involving a systematic campaign of violence of this type. An act of terrorism is even more threatening to the audience because it signals that there's more violence to come. Researchers have also tended to regard terrorism as a form of conspiratorial violence. This means that the organization that uses terrorism is typically an underground organization. It exists in conditions of extreme secrecy and clandestinity. Others think of terrorist actors as very loose networks, not as coherent or structured organizations, but as something more diffuse. Yet other views on the subject of what is terrorism and what is not think that if the users of violence are trying to acquire and hold territory, this is not terrorism. Terrorists are supposed to not want territory and to be diffuse transnational groupings that are in effect rootless. However, particularly in the 21st century, particularly post-2003, if we think about the relationship between terrorism and insurgency, the lines become very blurred. It's quite a bit less clear-cut. For example, in the conflict in Afghanistan, the U.S. developed the idea of a distinction between counterterrorism, or CT, and counterinsurgency, or COIN. Counterterrorism supposedly aimed at destroying and defeating a militant organization, for example, using drone strikes against leaders. COIN, or counterinsurgency, on the other hand, was aimed at winning over the support of a population to keep them from supporting insurgents who presumably needed both territory, a constituency, and resources that terrorists would not need. But the reality in both Afghanistan and now in Iraq is that the same organization can engage in both terrorism and insurgency, not one or the other. The Taliban and ISIS are certainly cases in point. And both of them wish to become a state. They wish to control territory. They both do and did control territory. They're not stateless organizations. They're not simply transnational conspiracies with no resources at all. They're capable of imposing control over territory and imposing their own form of government. This brings me back to one of the points that I started with in talking about defining terrorism. Terrorism is a method or a strategy that many different actors can use. Unfortunately, they may choose terrorism because it works for them. And this is a question that I'm going to return to in the third section of this lecture.